I recently finished reading Overcoming Multiple Sclerosis by Dr. George Jelinek, an Australian emergency medicine doctor who advocates for a 7-step lifestyle modification program to treat multiple sclerosis. I made extensive notes, and I'm going to summarize his recommendations so that you don't have to read the book. Let's have some fun. If you're new to my channel, I'm Brandon Beaber, and I post videos about MS every Wednesday, so please subscribe and ring that bell for notifications. The picture to your left is Dr. George Jelinek, who's famous for his Overcoming Multiple Sclerosis program, known as OMS. A brief history of Dr. George Jelinek. As I said, he's an emergency medicine doctor in Australia. And even before he got involved in OMS, he had extensive experience in epidemiologic research. And his mother had MS in her early 40s and had a very aggressive course, getting progressively worse and eventually committing suicide. Later, Dr. Jelinek himself was diagnosed with MS, and so he got very serious about researching the subject. And to his surprise, he found that there was extensive evidence suggesting an association between lifestyle and the disease. And he wrote his first book, Taking Control of MS, which is sort of a precursor to Overcoming Multiple Sclerosis. And back in 2002, he started running seminars about the subject, and he started a charity, Overcoming MS, and then he started his website, overcomingms.org, in 2008. And he used a lifestyle-based approach, and he also took medications such as glutathione acetate, and he did very well, later stopping medication, and he's somewhat older now and still doing very well. So he advocates a 7-step approach. Number 1 is diet, which is what the program is most famous for, but he also talks about sunlight exposure and vitamin D, exercise, meditation and stress management. He says that you should take medication if needed. He's not against medication, but thinks you should be judicious about the use and consider the side effects. And his last 2 chapters are about preventing multiple sclerosis in individuals who would be at risk, such as family members of people with MS. And he also talks about how to maintain the lifestyle changes that you've made for the rest of your life. So, to give some general principles, he really advocates an evidence-based approach. And in this book, there are over 50 pages of citations. It's extensively well-researched, and it's actually somewhat difficult to read because some of it reads like a giant review article. His recommendations are primarily based on epidemiologic and basic science research, just because there aren't a lot of good, large, long-term randomized trials on lifestyle. He did his own epidemiologic study called the HOLISM study, which is health outcomes and lifestyle in a sample of people with multiple sclerosis, where he had people fill out surveys giving patient-reported data on their lifestyle and their health outcomes. And some of the people in his study were within his seminars, people who he was directly involved with, but many people were international. They weren't really keeping a particular lifestyle, but he managed to recruit them into his study. And he also believes in using the best available evidence if no definitive evidence is available. And he sort of criticizes a lot of doctors and scientists because they're a little bit too strict and too skeptical. For example, he talks about how the vitamin D dose that he recommends isn't really that high because you can get a comparable amount from a very brief sun exposure. And he says that a lot of his recommendations are very safe and have other health benefits, so you shouldn't have to have definitive, provable evidence in order to implement these changes. Some principles based on his evidence, based on his epidemiologic studies, are that saturated fat, dairy, obesity, salt, low vitamin D, low sunlight exposure, and smoking are all associated with MS. Various studies find that fish and seafood intake, vegetable protein, and vegetable fiber are inversely related to MS and hence should be consumed. Although a lot of MS diets are against gluten and wheat, he argues that there's really no clear epidemiologic link between wheat consumption and multiple sclerosis or gluten consumption in MS, so he says whole grains are completely fine. And he gives some theoretical reasons why his recommendations may be beneficial. For example, saturated fats and trans fats have effects on cell membranes, making them stickier, and also promoting a T helper cell type 1 response, which is a type of autoimmune response known to be linked to diseases such as MS. He also talks about how his diet is fundamentally a plant-based diet, which may be favorable for general health and has been advocated by many other nutrition experts such as Dr. Dean Ornish, although they might not necessarily accept all of his recommendations because he does allow egg whites and seafood. So what is the diet? He suggests a whole foods, plant-based diet plus seafood. In other words, whole foods, unprocessed foods that are found in nature, primarily plant-based, fruits and vegetables with relatively few animal products, seafood being the major exception. So you would eat abundant fruits and vegetables, you could eat whole grains, legumes, and soy, and it would be relatively low in saturated fat, which is primarily in animal fats. It would also be high in omega-3 fatty acids relative to omega-6 fatty acids. There's evidence that omega-6 fatty acids contribute to inflammation. And he specifically recommends avoiding dairy, even though he admits the evidence is not 100% definitive. He does think there is an epidemiologic link between dairy and MS. And in his study, the HOLISM study, there was an association between dairy intake and worse outcome. You would also avoid meats such as chicken, beef, pork, and egg yolks, although you could eat fish, as I said, and egg whites are acceptable. Now, even plant fats may have some saturated fats. So you could eat things like avocado, olives, and oily fish, but in moderation. He also recommends alcohol in moderation. You would avoid processed foods, processed sugars, trans fats, adding salt to food, and sweetened drinks. He's against frying with oil because you can generate trans fats through heat when you fry with oils. And he also recommends avoiding any oil that is high in saturated fat or omega-6 fatty acids, such as palm oil, vegetable oil, and coconut products. However, extra virgin olive oil and sesame seed oil are acceptable. Now, he recommends very high-dose vitamin D supplementation. Vitamin D3 is preferred because it's closer to the biologically active form, 25-hydroxyvitamin D. If you're severely deficient, he advises a megadose, up to 600,000 international units. This sounds like a ridiculous dose, although he does provide some data that it may be safe, particularly if you're severely deficient. Chronic high-dose vitamin D can actually be quite dangerous. He suggests a goal 25-hydroxyvitamin D level, which is the lab report you're going to get for your active vitamin D, of 60 nanograms per milliliter. That's the value you would see if you live in the United States, or 150 nanomoles per liter, which is in certain laboratories internationally. So check the units there. And for many people, if they're adults, the maintenance dose is going to be around 5 to 10 international units of vitamin D3 per day, although he suggests that you periodically check your vitamin D levels, particularly at the end of winter when they're going to be the lowest. Now, in terms of other supplements, he specifically recommends against multivitamins and vitamin E and calcium, even though he recommended some of these things in his original book. And the reason for that is there's new epidemiologic evidence that multivitamins are not beneficial and may actually be harmful. However, he does recommend omega-3 fatty acid supplementation, either flaxseed oil or fish oil. If you were taking fish oil, the dose would be very high, 5 grams EPA plus DHA per day, which is a lot of capsules. But he actually finds in his HOLISM study that flaxseed oil may be even more associated with a better outcome. And just to clarify one thing, he does say that you should consume fish regardless of omega-3 fatty acid supplementation because there are some independent benefits of fish based on his study. He suggests that for certain individuals, B12 and iron supplementation could be beneficial, but you don't need to take them blindly. Now, sunlight has effects independent of vitamin D, so he strongly advises you to get some sunlight exposure, but you really don't need very much if you expose a large part of your body to the sun. So for instance, if you expose your entire body to the sun and you're relatively fair-skinned, you can generate 15,000 international units of vitamin D in only 15 minutes. It may be a little bit more if you're darker skin or it's overcast that day. And he recommends a brief but regular exposure over a large area of skin. He does not recommend that you get sunburns. And he believes that it's actually very safe to get regular but brief exposures to the sun, and that is not really linked to melanoma. It's really more chronic exposure or sunburns that are linked to skin cancers such as melanoma. And if the UV index is high and your skin is fair, you may need a very brief amount of sun, maybe 5 to 7 minutes in some cases. So for instance, if you're going out to the beach, you could wait out in the sun for 10 minutes and then put on sunscreen and enjoy the rest of the day, is one particular recommendation he gives. Now, some other things he talks about are exercise, both aerobic and resistance training are recommended. He recommends stress management with meditation, such as mindful meditation, and he thinks that 30 minutes a day is a good amount of meditation to shoot for. He thinks that prolonged and severe stress is bad, and you may want to sort of address those issues. If you're a shift worker, you may want to look for another career possibly. And he talks about optimism and hopefulness and how that's very important to have a good mindset, and that actually helps you stick with the program as well. And he gives some specific advice about relaxation, such as progressive muscle relaxation. And he also talks about keeping a diary and avoiding smoking. And if you are smoking, he thinks the best method is really just to quit cold turkey. And that is, in fact, how most smokers successfully quit smoking. Now, he has quite a large section on medications. Even though it's primarily a book dedicated to lifestyle, he's very knowledgeable about medications, and he talks about all of the disease-modifying medications that were known about in 2016 and were available in 2016 when the book was published. And he talks about the benefits and the studies and the side effects. And he gives some specific ideas. For instance, he recommends that for relapses, you should consider oral steroids instead of intravenous steroids, because there's a European study suggesting that they're equally beneficial and oral steroids are much more convenient. He acknowledges that epidemiologic studies, including his HOLISM study, do seem to favor disease-modifying therapy use, although he is somewhat skeptical of their side effects and thinks that you really need to sort of discuss it with a trusted physician. In terms of the injectable medications, he favors glatiramer, perhaps because of his own experiences with it, but also he thinks the evidence favors glatiramer in the long run and that it has a very good safety profile. In terms of the oral medications, he favors Tecfidera. He also talks about some non-standard treatment. For instance, intravenous immunoglobulin, IVIG, he believes is underused and relatively safe. Many neurologists would not believe this to be a proven treatment for MS. He also talks about some unusual combinations of treatments, such as azathioprine plus beta interferon. And this has been used by some old school neurologists, and I have used it myself a few times, and there is one very promising study on this combination. And he talks about low-dose naltrexone, although he notes that in the HOLISM study, there didn't seem to be a benefit for this medication. And he recommends that if you have very aggressive onset MS, you consider a higher efficacy therapy, such as Tysabri or alemtuzumab, if you're becoming rapidly disabled, just to shut the disease down. Well, I hope that was useful to you. I'll stop there. But next week, I'm going to post my review of the book and my personal opinion. So please subscribe and ring that bell.